Okay, good. Welcome, everyone. I think this is now fine to start. We have lots of participants here online. Thanks a lot. We have more than 30 people now, 40 people online here. This is fantastic. So my name is Philip Nell. I'm the head of the Institute for International Business, and I'm the academic director of the Executive MBA Bucharest, one of the MBA programs that the Executive Academy is running and is offering. Today I will talk about what are the COVID-19 implications on international strategies of firms. And before I go and dig into the details, I would like to very quickly introduce not only myself, but also 2-3 other people who are here from the EU Executive Academy. So there's, for example, right now with me here in the call, there's Adriana Georgescu, our program manager from the EU Executive Academy, specifically program manager for the Executive MBA in Bucharest. And then there's also Anna Patterson, whom you might be able to contact later on for all kinds of additional questions, also with regards to other programs of the EU Executive Academy, such as our PMBA programs, etc. I will directly jump in. This is going to be also what we call sometimes a teaser lecture, meaning that this could be a lecture that more or less like this in this form also happens in our MBA programs right now. We do this, of course, nowadays online here and there, but of course, a lecture like this or a session like this would very similarly work also in the offline, old school, face-to-face world. I directly jump into the details now. Corona-19, globalization, internationalization of firms, the global strategy of firms, this is big time in the news, big time in the topics. And I'm very sure that a lot of you are also influenced by the crisis, also in your job, in your work life, as well as in your personal life. So just to give you an idea here of a couple of articles from Forbes, from Bloomberg, from BBC, but also down here on the right-hand side from The Economist. So where they say coronavirus has killed globalization, or maybe the end of globalization. Bloomberg says the coronavirus will not kill globalization. BBC asks, will coronavirus reverse globalization? So lots of different types of questions. And of course, there are a couple of immediate influences on our businesses, on our work life. But let's get a little bit further into the details. So what I would like to do in this session, I would like to discuss with you some basics of globalization, some aspects that we perceive maybe in a particular way, and also ask them very much from an analytical perspective, what are the key drivers of a couple of firm internationalization and international management decisions, and how is COVID-19 or Corona really influencing this stuff? So can we derive some hypotheses, or can we derive some thesis regarding how the world will look in the future based on our analytics? That's the key question. This will be interactive, so I will also use some polls in a minute, and I hope that you can all participate then well with these polls. It usually works well when you're on a laptop. I hope it also works well if you join us today just based on your mobile phone, your mobile device. So I directly jump into these questions. Very good, super. So why did I ask you these kind of questions? Well, from a theoretical perspective, when we talk about globalization, we actually talk about something slightly different than what is often talked about in the press, or when laymen talk about this. So very often when laymen talk about it, and when we read about globalization in the press, we see words like the global village, and we have developed into a situation where there's one single world, and there's maybe what can be called the death of distance, meaning that distance in itself really doesn't matter anymore. And one of the big proponents of this is a very famous book from a journalist called Thomas Friedman, who has written this book called "The World is Flat," right? So there's no differences anymore between the different countries in the world. The world is flat. It's basically one single world that we can talk about And of course, to some extent, we see this with the COVID crisis. To some extent, we can say, yes, Corona has influenced immediately all countries in the world in very similar ways, and many countries have responded in very similar ways. So to some extent, there's something right about it. The world is flat. We have grown together. This is one global village, maybe. But on the other hand, if we really look at the key indicators of globalization, then what we would usually do from an analytical perspective, we would say, okay, let's put it down to some good numbers. Let's define globalization, and let's define globalization really as the share of international or cross-border transfers and flows as compared to within country flows and transactions. For example, trade, or for example, capital, for example, information and people. You might immediately see what I'm going for. This is, by the way, also the 4 freedoms of the European Union, where there's a free flow of goods, of capital, of information, and of people within the European Union, right? So this is typically, the dimensions or the pillars, you could say, of globalization. Now, in trade, for example, we could say, what's the percentage or the extent of exports or imports as compared to total GDP, right? As a measure of globalization, the higher exports or imports as in percent of GDP, the higher we would say globalization is. Or in capital, relatively the same thing, total foreign direct investment as a percentage of total investments, right? How much is this? So how many of the investments really cross borders? And what's the percentage here? Or stock market investments, how much of the stock market investments really cross borders, are in a financial flow to outside of the home country of the investor? So what's the percent international stock market investments compared to non-international domestic stock market investments, and so on and so forth. Phone calls, I just asked you this question. Facebook friends, how many of the Facebook friends are internationally, not in the same country as yours, as compared to in the same country that you have, or where you are seated? Tourist flows, students at universities, etc., etc. So trade, capital, information, people flows, international, cross-border, as compared to domestic or total. And what we can see here is that, and I don't go here into the details, but what we can see is a lot of those numbers, and these are real numbers from the World Trade Organization, for example, from very good statistical sources. These numbers are often relatively low. So foreign direct investment as compared to total investment is relatively low. We are somewhere at the 10% level. Stock market investments, we are far below the 50% line. Phone calls is actually tiny percentage. Facebook friends, again, very small. Tourist numbers that come from abroad, if we look at this from a worldwide perspective, is very low as compared to total tourists. Students at university is tiny. We approximately have worldwide 2-3% of students that are international, that are coming from another country and become regular students in another country. And this is a tiny percentage as compared to all those students who remain in their home country. So what we say sometimes is that the share of international cross-border interactions is often, and has been historically, relatively small, despite the fact that it has increased a lot, of course, over the last 20, 30, 40 years with ongoing globalization, but it's still relatively small. Sometimes there's kind of a rule of thumb that says, we're somewhere at the 20% mark, very roughly, right? So roughly 20% cross-border versus 80% non-cross-border. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because if we look at this from an analytical perspective in science, and we say, well, we can make up two extremes in a continuum here. On the one hand, we have a situation of total non-globalization, no globalization whatsoever. And on the right-hand side, we have total globalization. Everything is totally globalized. So 100% of all the foreign direct investments would be crossing borders. Then we can say we are probably somewhere over here. Now, we are not in a situation where we have total fragmentation and a very strong dominance of the nation states, but we are also far from notions such as the world is flat, or we just have one world in a global village, and distance and borders and so on do not matter anymore, right? Because of this, because we are somewhere here with our 20% mark, right? The 20% mark that I was just talking about here with a yellow line, right? Roughly a rule of thumb, 20% is international as compared to non-international. If this is true, if we're somewhere over here, let it be 30%, whatever, doesn't matter. Therefore, we talk about, not about globalization in science, we actually talk about a situation which is called semi-globalization. It's not full globalization that we have achieved already, it is semi-globalized. Sometimes in some other words, we also use the term transnational environment. Doesn't matter, it's a different term for it, but I think key for you, we talk about the term semi-globalization in science and never about globalization. So what does this mean? Now, what are the consequences here? So semi-globalization actually means a couple of things, but interestingly, if we look at what people think about globalization, well, then they tend to forget the semi. We apparently there's a strong tendency by people to think that this bubble here is moving much more, has moved much more to the right side. We are much more globalized than what the data would suggest if we look at this on a worldwide perspective. So let's look at here on some hard facts that substantiates my claim. So my key point is that we laymen, and we often overestimate globalization. So here you see now two different bars. You see the light blue ones, these are the survey responses, and there's thousands of students, politicians, and managers have been asked here. I've asked these kind of questions in large events at the VU with 400 or 500 participants 2-3 years ago. So this is pretty hard data, what people think, what the ratio is, exports in terms of percentage of GDP or FDI outflows, etc. And the dark blue ones is the correct value, right? That really is in the statistics. And now it doesn't matter again to look exactly what the numbers are, but the key point is really clear. Every single light blue bar is larger than the dark one. Every single one in essentially every single dimension, in trade flows, capital flows, information flows, and people flows. And that means we are really overestimating, you are potentially overestimating the extent of globalization constantly as compared to, you know, what really the state of globalization is. Now, there's many reasons for this. Let's look at some of those things here a bit more detail. Please remember, when I asked you in the polls, I asked you about the phone calls and the student at university. Let's look at this. So here, this is from a couple of years ago, as I told you, from 2017, where I asked in an event more than 500 people the correct answer for how many percent of the Fortune Global 500 firms have a foreign CEO. That's definitely in bracket A. It has changed slightly since 2017, but not much. So at that time, 14% of the people were right, or in other ways formulated, 86% of the audience in 2017 overestimated globalization in terms of percentage of global Fortune 500 foreign CEOs. Similar picture here. What's the percentage of telephone calls that cross borders? Here, 76% overestimated globalization. Or here, how many percent of regular students? Here, 84% of the audience members overestimated the number of students that are really studying full-time in a different country as compared to their home country. And that really shows to you this is really deeply ingrained in us. For many reasons, we seem to have this feeling, this picture that globalization is very, very advanced, much more than it ever was. Right? And that shows to you also here. This is maybe a different way of showing it to you. This is a picture of the world. This is a world map, but it is a world map which is shaped by or slightly modified, you could say, by the extent of cross-border flows. So this is the map seen from the perspective of the country of Austria, and when there's a lot of imports. Same picture, by the way, if we do exports. The more there's imports and exports between Austria, here in dark red, with another country, the bigger this country would be shown on this map, and it would be inflated. So you could say it's the size of the country on the map gets bigger if we have more imports or exports from Austria. And this is how the world looks from an Austrian perspective. Right? So you see Germany, big time, super important. Switzerland, super important. Some neighboring countries here, Slovakia, for example, Croatia, Hungary, so super important. Benelux, maybe. By the way, UK already much smaller than it is supposed to be. The US is tiny. South America basically doesn't really exist on the map. China, a gigantic country, is relatively small. And Australia, Indonesia, and so on, these countries are basically inexistent. Africa as an entire continent on this map is in essence inexistent. Okay, so this really shows to you. So the globalization is not very advanced. At most, we can say there is some regionalization going on. There's lots of cross-border flows of various types. In this case here, imports, exports, with some neighboring countries. Maybe here and there with some specific countries as well, maybe like here Vietnam for whatever reason, but in essence it is not global. It is at maximum regional. So why is this, and what kind of conclusions do we derive from this? Well, let's look at the conclusions here in terms of global strategy, international strategy of firms, and because we in science, we know that this is super important here, right? This semi-globalization, we have said, okay, we need to look at and disentangle, understand the differences between them of different types of distances or differences between countries. Right? And we would usually talk about this and say, this is the CAGE framework, right? So CAGE, we would say there's cultural differences between countries, such as language differences, religious differences, normative differences. There's administrative differences between countries, differences in political systems, in the law system, in terms of trade agreements being present or not. Brexit, case in point, for example, where this has now just in this very moment massively changed for the UK. We have geographic distance, which is not only the mere kilometers or miles of distance to another country. It's also about difficulties of infrastructure, transportation from one country to another country, or economic distances or differences, as we say, such as big income differences between countries, cost differences between countries, quality of resources differences between countries, etc., etc. Right? So these are the four different things that we look at, and because of these four different distances, cultural, administrative, geographic, economic distances, pictures like this here look like they are, right? Because it's very, from a cultural, economic, geographic perspective, it's very nice and easy to deal with Germany, therefore there's lots of activity. Yeah? And it's much, much more cumbersome already with the UK, and it's even much more difficult with Africa or South America or another kind of region in the world. So these are the four basic pillars of analysis. And let's now, before we jump further, let's look at your conclusions, okay? I first jump into your first question. Here you can see how many percent of the foreign Fortune Global 500 firms have a foreign CEO. 18% of you were correct. Yeah, the correct one is the first box. And more than here, or 72%, 82% were wrong. So 82% of you misunderstand or overestimate globalization measured in this particular way. What about the second one? Second question. I share my results again. Here, what is percentage of telephone calls? Here, again, 15% of you are correct. 85% of you overestimated globalization. Very, very similar results. And as I said before, and as I've shown to you, very similar to a lot of different audiences. If I ask politicians, if I ask managers, if I ask students, young students, old students at university, MBA students, bachelor students, it doesn't matter. It's very, very similar results. And third question, let's see if you're a little bit different here. Share results. So how many of the students study abroad full-time? Here it's a much better number. Here we have approximately a third of you, a bit slightly less than a third of you being correct, while 70% of you are wrong. Just to be clear how to interpret this, if you had no idea, if you were just putting in your response to my online poll here randomly, then we would expect 25% everywhere, right? 25, 25, 25, 25. Here you're better than average. So here you had a very good feeling, a much better feeling than most of the other audiences in terms of estimating how globalization looks here in terms of people flows, specifically student flows. Very good, thank you. But still, 2 out of 3 questions, very clear that you are overestimating globalization. Let's look at some further numbers here regarding the real impact of Corona. Then we move more into the Corona debate. We see trade volume dropping heavily, right? Investment flows dropping heavily. International travel, everybody knows of that already. No one of us has really booked a vacation last year, this year. Really pessimistic forecast from some months ago is even better here and there for some countries. This has dropped tremendously. We are back to levels of the 1990s in terms of travel, in terms of investment flow. We are back to the years of the 2000s. And in terms of international trade volume, we are also back to the years of the 2000s. So 20 years of development has just disappeared. If you remember, however, my point about semi-globalization, I mean, while globalization was pushing ahead, it was still, that was my key point from before, and it was still relatively low, lower than what you thought. So in that sense, that now that we're going back down with trade flows, investment flows, international flows, people flows, in the end, nothing has changed conceptually. From a theoretical perspective, we would still say, well, it's still about semi-globalization. Yeah, semi-globalization is clear. There's drivers for globalization, but we still have lots of differences, cultural, economic, administrative distances across countries, and they're still very, very important. Now, Corona has given them apparently a boost. And this is where it's having this impact on the different types of flows. So let me explain to you now a couple of key points what I think is important for firm strategies. So from my perspective, Corona and the Corona crisis is doing nothing else than putting a spotlight on borders and how they inhibit flows across countries, on differences across countries, and on the role of geographic distance. All 3 of those things have existed beforehand and were impactful beforehand, but now there's spotlight on it because Corona actually gives us very concrete examples of, hey, borders matter a lot. Hey, differences across countries matter a lot. Geographic distance matters a lot. Specifically, now we see this during times of Corona. And there are several implications. Now let's go through them. I have I've come up with some of my suggestions and my hypotheses that I have alongside this very basic framework of strategy which is a semi-globalization framework, you could say. And in essence, in strategy or in global strategy, we talk about where to compete and how to compete. Let me not check so much here on the question where to compete. Let me focus, however, here on how to compete. So how do firms achieve competitive advantage during semi-globalization? Well, there's three basic strategies that firms are usually applying. First, they're trying aggregation strategies, which is standardizing, harmonizing offers and products and approaches across countries, or an arbitrage strategy, which is a strategy which tries to profit from differences across countries, or an adaptation strategy, which is the opposite of the aggregation strategy. An adaptation strategy is, my strategy is to adapt to every specific little country. And these are the three basic strategies that we can deal with. And every multinational corporation, every firm that is somehow internationally active has to deal with aggregation, arbitrage, or adaptation. Now come my hypotheses. Hypothesis number one. If we really assume that Corona has a big impact here, and if we boil this down towards the different types of distances and differences across countries, then we need to say, okay, what has Corona really done? Corona has meant that suddenly borders are much more closed than before. Traveling is much more restricted. Geographic distance suddenly becomes a big hurdle. And there's a lot of differences across countries, many differences which will become more severe in the next months. For example, China is out of the crisis much earlier than many other countries. So the total economic development of China will really push ahead, whereas some other countries will fall behind. Within Europe, Austria is hit much more than Romania, for example. The GDP is down 10% in Austria for some measures and quarters, whereas it's not that bad in Romania. Maybe to some extent, for example, because Austria is much more tourism driven in terms of its economy. So Corona is putting a lot of emphasis on these borders and differences and distances across countries. So therefore, hypothesis number one, pure aggregation strategies that are built on the absence of borders and the absence of differences across countries is probably much less likely, right? Usually here, the observation that we can make is during these types of crises, and Corona is one example of them, where distances and differences across borders become the spotlight again, aggregation strategies need to be reevaluated. Second hypothesis. If distances and differences become more important again due to Corona, well then obviously arbitrage strategies that try to profit from differences across countries, and therefore also flexibility across countries, needs to become more important again. Right? So aggregation strategy down, arbitrage strategies should go up. In this context, domestic competitors, which previously maybe haven't played a big role, but now because of the closedness of countries again, they might become much more important. So firms need to be aware of domestic competitors, or said the other way around, there might be now strategic options for domestic firms to get some market share in their domestic markets because the multinational corporations have difficulties. Fourth hypothesis, you need to be prepared to divest from certain countries because of all the differences, geographic distance, and the difficulties of doing business across borders. A lot of times firms might say, okay, it doesn't make sense anymore, especially compared to domestic competitors that might become much stronger here. We need to divest, right? So this is the time now for divestment strategies. And finally, because of these differences or changes and modifications in strategy, aggregation, arbitrage, etc., also organizational structures might need to be adapted. And one of the key points is, of course, also very obvious here, international business travel. So large multinational corporations in the past, they have really thrived on, were built on the fact that international business travel is a key component of the firms. Managers would fly around, visit plants, visit subsidiaries abroad. Subsidiary managers would come to the headquarters, meet other subsidiaries in other countries. All the learning, coordination, control that goes on within large firms, a lot of this was based on international business travel, and suddenly this is gone. Right? Suddenly this is very, very different. And this can have massive consequences. So just to show to you here, this is a picture from a recent project that I've done with a large multinational corporation. Here we have asked 128 respondents within one firm, within 78 subunits. We've asked the question, to what extent now Corona has changed the internal communication coordination mechanisms that are going on, because there's a lot more online MS Teams or Zoom communication and no business travel. And you can see here, there's slight difference. This is average picture, so sometimes this was much more extreme for some units or divisions as for others. But this is a relatively typical picture. So one of the key things here is down here, number 2 and 3. What they've perceived is that daily cooperation with headquarter people has really increased. Maybe not much on average, but for some units quite a lot has increased. And at the same time, much more dramatically, communication with sister subunits, with sister subsidiaries or affiliates in other countries, for example, has really decreased. So if you think about this, then this means that vertical communication was even increased a little bit, because maybe it was headquarters setting up all kinds of MS Teams or Zoom meetings. Constantly you're hanging around in these meetings with some senior guys in there. And lateral communication, horizontal communication between peers in different countries, for example, is really going down. Partly probably because a lot of communication that usually happens along formal meetings. So for example, in front of the coffee machine or so on, where, one general manager of one country would talk to the general manager of the other country. A lot of this is disappearing in these online meetings. And this, of course, has to be taken into account when you now further work with the firm and try to implement this strategy. So let's go back. These are my couple of core theses. Rethink your aggregation strategy. Probably in times of Corona, there's less aggregation possible. More arbitrage strategy. Adaptation, yes, maybe, but that means also domestic competitors become more important, and sometimes you will lose and you need to divest. And all of this usually is accompanied by organizational structural changes, such as those that facilitate communication, coordination, or particular, if you adapt your aggregation strategy, if you down tune your aggregation strategy, well then organizational structural changes might go hand in hand here. So for example, just to give you a couple of examples, Danone, the big French fast-moving consumer goods firm, has just now also COVID-related announced that they will go down a little bit with their aggregation strategy, will do less standardization, less harmonization, less synergy creation across different countries. They will regionalize much more, and this has meant also a downsizing of corporate structures in favor of more local and regional structures. And they'll go much more for adaptation strategies, much less for aggregation strategies. On another fast-moving consumer goods firms that I was doing a project with, they're talking a lot about domestic competitors being much more stronger now than beforehand, simply that because they can work in an environment suddenly where the competition from large multinationals is a little bit less severe. To give another example, if you just observed the infamous crisis now that is in Austria about Made in Austria, where of course the politicians potentially have tried to put a lot of emphasis on locally produced protection safety masks, and then there was a scandal about it and how these masks were produced and so on. And in the end, they were sourced from China. That shows to you also that also politics might play a role here and might try to make domestic competitors much more much stronger in the end. In this case, of course, it backfired, and still supply was coming in the end from a country far away, where there was lots of manufacturing production capacity available. So these are my couple of theses, and I'm very happy to discuss with you now your questions and comments that you might have. So please. Good, thank you very much. This was a very short, very intense session. I have now just one little slide at the very end that I would like to show to you if you're still interested here in this. I would like to tell you that, of course, now we are running still with our programs at VU Executive Academy. So a lot of our programs are starting towards the second half or at the end of this year. So we have new programs starting, professional MBAs, executive MBAs. I'm the one responsible, together with Adriana Georgescu, who's also online, for the executive MBA Bucharest. And I'm happy to tell you that we also have this year, we have some scholarships available for you in case that you are interested in joining our programs. We have, for example, which is very important from my perspective, the female leaders scholarships, which are available to you. We also have, for those that are residents of Romania, a specific series of scholarships available to you via the newspaper Ziarul Financiar, where we have the deadline in May 25, so roughly 2 months from now, where we have substantial scholarships on offer, and we have also in general merit and need-based scholarships for the executive MBA in Bucharest, where the deadline is end of June 2021, and you can start applying. You will find lots of more information online at VU Executive Academy website, and of course, as I just said, it's not only that we have some of those scholarships here for the executive MBA Bucharest, but also for the other MBA programs that VU is offering. The only one that is very specific to Bucharest is the Ziarul Financiar scholarship, which is exclusively for the Bucharest Executive MBA. So if you have further questions regarding this, have a look at the website, but also you can drop us a line. Anna Patterson is online. Here's also her contact information, and of course also Adriana Georgescu is still online here, and you can see that she has put up a link to our program, for example, and to ways of financing the program managing program membership, participation. She's put in the link online, and you can also start chatting with us here and continue chatting with us now that I'm done with my little session. So thank you very much for joining. Have a nice evening. Hope you took something out of the session. Thank you.